It's blamed Tehran for the attack on Saudi oil facilities. Now the US says it's building a coalition against Iran. But can that guarantee security in the Gulf region? Or would diplomacy be a better choice? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the programme. I'm Imran Khan. The Gulf region is on the edge. Who's responsible for last week's attacks on Saudi oil infrastructure, which have led to accusations from all of the different sides? The US and Saudi Arabia say Iran is behind the Aramco strikes, but the Houthis in Yemen say they are responsible, and they've warned of more to come. The US Secretary of State visited allies in Saudi Arabia and the UAE to hold talks with their leaders. Mike Pompeo said Washington was seeking a peaceful resolution to the crisis, but blamed Iran for seeking an all-out war. Iran's foreign minister says the US is preparing to use the Aramco incident as an excuse to attack his country, and that Tehran's ready to defend itself.
There will be more sanctions. We have set about a course of action to deny Iran the capacity and the wealth so that they can conduct their to prevent them from conducting their terror campaigns. And you can see from the events of last week, there's still more work to do, and we're going to continue to drive towards that end. You cannot fail to see the failed policy of giving money to this regime by what happened in Saudi Arabia.
Iran's foreign minister has responded, criticizing Americans' involvement in the war in Yemen. Mohammed Javad Zarif tweeted a list of crimes he accused the Saudi-led and US-backed coalition of committing in Yemen, saying, 4 years of bombing has left 100,000 Yemenis dead, millions malnourished and suffering from cholera. But when Yemen carries out retaliatory strikes on Saudi oil tankers, the US calls it an unacceptable act of war. In another tweet, Zarif says Iran has been more responsible, calling for peace and security in the Gulf and putting forward peace plans for Yemen and Syria. Let's bring in our guest. Nader Hashemi is the director of the Center for Middle East Studies at the University of Denver. He's joining us here in Doha. Mohammed Marandi is Professor of American Studies at the University of Tehran, and he joins us from Tehran. And Adolfo Franco is a Republican strategist, former advisor to Senator John McCain. He joins us from Washington, D.C. A welcome to you all. I'd like to begin in D.C. first with Adolfo Franco. Now, what we're seeing right now is a fairly impotent reaction from Washington to these attacks on the Aramco oil facilities. We're seeing a lot of a blame game going on. It's being blamed on the Iranians. The Houthis say it was actually them, but no real reactions. There has been some sort of sanctions. The US has always prided itself on securing oil out of the Gulf. It's been a 30-year relationship that way. Has that now changed?
No, not at all. And I do not believe it's been a weak response, and I don't think the full response has yet to be heard. The president obviously has been briefed, in fact, extensively yesterday, and today will actually be presented with a series of options. And those options range from, frankly, full-out military strike and retaliation against Iran to everything to additional and more strengthened sanctions. You're absolutely right. We have a long-standing, decades-old policy of alliances with the Gulf states, and we'll continue to protect their assets, their security. There's no question about doing so. However, the United States will not act unilaterally without consultations, as Secretary Pompeo has done, precisely with those allies to see the scope of what they deem to be an appropriate response. This is clear aggression by Iran. We know the origin of these comes from the northwest. That's not the geography that would point to Yemen. And even if it were Yemen, which it is not, of course that would be Iranian sponsored and controlled, as is the situation in Hezbollah and other places where they use their proxies. So this is clearly Iran in every shape, way, and form. The response to the United States is yet to be heard. There are U.S. senators calling for a very strong military reaction toward Iran, and the president has said everything's on the table. And as he said the other day, we're locked and loaded, meaning he's prepared to do a military response as necessary.
Mohammed Marandi in Tehran. The U.S. is locked and loaded. It clearly blames Iran for all of this. Is it Iran?
So we're supposed to believe that a swarm of drones and missiles either crossed the Persian Gulf or came from the north of the Persian Gulf all the way down, across, passing by U.S. military bases, naval ships, and the huge military presence that Western countries have across the Persian Gulf region. And then the Saudis with hundreds of billions of dollars of American weapons based all over the place, and all of them directed, most of them directed towards Iran, because that's how the Saudis have spent their money over the last few decades. Yet none of these drones were detected. None of these missiles were detected. I don't think anyone here takes that very seriously. When the Americans sent a $200 million drone into Iranian airspace just a few months ago, minutes after it entered Iranian airspace, it was downed by an Iranian-made surface-to-air missile. So perhaps the Saudis should buy Iranian-made products instead of American-made products. And then there's the other argument that until now, whenever drone strikes were carried out by the Yemeni resistance and the Yemeni armed forces, the Western pundits would say that these weapons came from Iran and they were sent to Yemen. Yet that narrative suddenly has disappeared in this attack. So while the strikes have become more and more impressive over the last few months, deeper inside Saudi territory, with greater precision, suddenly they no longer make that claim about Yemen. So no one here believes the American argument, and we know how the Americans falsify information for the sake of their own foreign policy agenda. But if the Americans make, and it is true that the Americans are allies of Saudi Arabia. They've been allies when they helped create Al-Qaeda, when they helped, and then the blowback was 9/11. They've been allies when the Saudis have been spreading extremism across the world because it was in the interest of the United States. They've been allies for a very long time. That's absolutely correct.
Let me bring in Adolfo Franco here. There is this idea that the Saudis are very embarrassed that the Houthis managed to mount an attack such as this, and it's just convenient to blame Iran. That's what we're hearing from the Iranian side, certainly.
There's something illogical about my colleague's rationale. He just said that it was implausible that something could attack, drones could attack Saudi fields because they're armed to the teeth and the sophistication, and this is just impossible. Yet, they can be coming from Yemen, and somehow that's plausible. Either it's implausible, and this was all a setup by Saudi Arabia and the United States, which, you know, if you believe conspiracy theories, okay. But the evidence is otherwise, since the material that has been examined is Iranian.
But that's not what I said.
So if the drones can be, you just said that it's implausible to believe that Saudi facilities would not be protected by sophisticated. Yes,
actually,
I was listening
I'm
to you.
going to just interrupt you there for a second, Adolfo. That isn't actually what Mohammed Marandi said. Actually, what he said was that no one of the American forces that were based, and there's a lot of them in the region, noticed these swarm of drones coming over. Let's just leave it there for a second. Let me bring in Nader Hashemi here. Clearly, there is big differences on both sides when it comes to the narrative here. Is there a political way out of this, or are we at the stage where somebody is going to have to attack somebody else's capital?
Well, there is a political way out of it, and it speaks to the point that was just discussed with your other two guests. What we need right now is a international, independent, UN-led commission of inquiry to determine culpability and then accountability for the attack on the Saudi oil facilities. Now, it would be good to hear from the government of Saudi Arabia as to whether they would support such a UN-led independent inquiry, because when it comes to UN-led independent inquiries in the context of the war in Yemen, they've strongly opposed those independent inquiries. And the Islamic Republic of Iran has also had a horrific track record when it comes to pursuing and accepting the results of UN-led independent inquiries with respect to regional destabilization. And I'm talking about what the UN has said and done with respect to Iran's horrific involvement in Syria. So I think that's one way of resolving this issue. That's the way forward. In terms of the broader political conflict that we see unfolding right now that has brought this region to the precipice, I think we're in desperate need of diplomacy. The problem is that there's very few options that we have that we can pursue with respect to a diplomatic settlement. The United States and Iran don't talk to one another. Donald Trump has surrounded himself with a bunch of war hawks that have been very reluctant to pursue diplomacy, although Donald Trump, and I hate to say this, but Donald Trump, to his credit, has opened the door to a dialogue with Iran. Unfortunately, the authoritarian leaders in Tehran have no interest in pursuing dialogue. So I think this is, I think, the sticking point that needs to be resolved if we want to get away from a disastrous war that we're on the precipice of.
Adolfo Franco, would a UN inquiry satisfy this U.S. administration?
I would be all in favor of that. I can't imagine the administration wouldn't as well, but there's only one problem with that. In principle, that sounds nice. From a theoretical point of view, the point is this. I think Iran, as it's done in the past, would just reject it. So what? This is at the end of the day, UN. So therefore, I don't know how long that inquiry would take. It would be contested. There's no question the results of it. That's not some body that everybody would meaning the UN, a body that anyone would necessarily respect. And what would be the remedy afterwards? Let's say after this long, it would take a while, this long inquiry, Iran actually was the culprit. Then what happens? In terms of, do we have a military strike 6 months from now in retaliation? So that's one problem. But the comment made about diplomacy is an important one. It's Foreign Minister Zarif who has taken diplomacy and the Ayatollah Khamenei who has taken them off the table when the instructions have been given to speak to no American official. President Trump has never said that. He said to no American official, including the officials in New York. There were some in Washington who had advocated to revoke the visas for the Iranian delegation to even travel to the UN meetings next week in New York. And that was rejected by President Trump. I think President Trump is open to the dialogue. The problem is Iran. But at the end of the day, the culprit in the region for the instability is Iran. We know that, whether it's in Syria, Lebanon, or Yemen. This is the regime that has been exporting terrorism, and as a consequence of very tough sanctions, which are now going to be stiffened, Iran is lashing out. I understand it from a standpoint of global politics that Iran has few options since it's unable to break through the sanctions with European allies to resort to military threats to say this is what's going to happen if these sanctions continue. But the culprit for all of these activities beyond this incident is Iran.
Mohammed Miranda, your reaction, please.
Well, I disagree with both of your guests. First of all, with regards to Syria, the UN did nothing until 2013. And when Iran actually entered Syria was when there were already tens of thousands of foreign fighters who were funded and brought into the country. If it wasn't for Iran, we'd have black flags flying both over Damascus and Baghdad. It's absolutely correct, and it's well documented.
That's propaganda.
It's absolutely true. And Hezbollah actually entered Syria in the middle of 2013.
Iran has been supporting Assad from day one. Stop lying,
Mohammed.
Mohammed.
Many who were silent about the... Look at the Defense Intelligence Agency document of 2012, which belongs to your own government. Have a bit of
from the beginning of the Syrian war, Iran has been backing a war criminal.
It's reflective of your government's behavior.
The human rights documentation,
the 2012 Defense Intelligence Agency document of the United States.
Anyone to read.
If you don't allow me to talk, it just is reflective of the regime in Washington's behavior, how it silences any sort of critique. Iranians have no voice anywhere. If they can't have 5 minutes on Al Jazeera, then that's really saying
they don't have it in their own country
lot.
either because of your policies.
I advise all of your viewers to go and read.
No, we will get to you, but let's allow Mohammed to have his say.
No, yes, he won't let me talk. I advise your viewers to read the U.S. Defense Intelligence Agency document of 2012, where the United States and that organization was led by General Flynn, Michael Flynn. He also in Al Jazeera stated that the United States allowed the extremists, they allowed their allies in the region to support the extremists, and the extremists had the upper hand in the fighting, and they, according to the document, were trying to create a Salafist entity between Syria and Iraq. This was early on in the fighting, and Iran came well after that. But with regards to when we talk about the UN, let's look at Yemen. The UN only had the Saudi regime on their blacklist for 72 hours, and then they removed it. So when we talk about the UN, we're not talking about an unbiased body. The UN, when Saddam Hussein invaded Iran, they never condemned the aggressor during the war. And when they used chemical weapons, and I survived 2 chemical attacks, and friends of mine didn't. When chemical weapons were used in Iran, the UN Security Council never condemned the United States or Saddam Hussein or any of the European countries who supported them. But the real story here is the war in Yemen, which is quite obvious, the most horrific story in the 21st century. This war has to come to an end. The Saudi regime, if they do not want their assets to be targeted, the only way forward is for them to stop bombing schools, stop bombing hospitals, funerals, weddings, school buses, and starving the country with the help of the United States and others. Any support that the Iranians have given to the people of Yemen in their resistance against the Saudi aggression is nothing compared to what the United States and its allies in the region and its allies in Europe have done for Saudi Arabia.
Adolfo, I will get you in just a second. I want to bring in Nader Hashemi here in Doha. You heard what our guest in Tehran, Mohammed Morandi, had to say. It's all about Yemen. This is where we're at, and this is what needs to change. However, you seem to have some strong opinions.
I would agree with him that the war in Yemen is horrific, and it has destabilized the region, and it has led to a huge humanitarian catastrophe. But so has the war in Syria, which Mohammed Morandi is defending in terms of Iranian participation. That has killed, roughly 500,000 people, and Iran has very bloody hands for what it has been doing in Yemen. So there's a lot of regional instability that's taking place.
And I think if you want to be objective,
one has to be able to attribute blame to all of the destabilizing actors. That's Saudi Arabia, that's the Islamic Republic of Iran, that's the State of Israel, and that's also the United States government. Absolutely. See, the difference between Mohammed Morandi and I is that I'm not an apologist for the United States government. In fact, I'm very critical of U.S. foreign policy, both in the past and the present, unlike him, who's a crass apologist for everything that comes out of the mouth of Ali Khamenei.
Well, let's bring in Adolfo Franco here. Let's also, gentlemen, try and keep this...
The language that you use reflects who you are.
Let's keep this civilized. Adolfo Franco, it's very difficult for the Iranians to come to the negotiating table if you keep putting sanctions on them. If you sanction their senior leadership, it becomes very difficult for them to actually sell it to their people and come back to the negotiating table. What's the way out for the US here?
Well, number one, you're absolutely right, and this is precisely why Iran launched this attack, in my opinion, against Saudi Arabia. It's to demonstrate that they have no options but to flex their muscles in the region and send a warning shot, which was heard in Saudi Arabia and the Gulf states, that this could mean all-out war, which the Saudi Arabia and the UAE does not want. So the way out of but here's the bigger problem for the United States, and I really respect the other guest who I disagree with in Doha, because he is right. He's critical of the U.S., but he's also critical of the other side. So I have a different view, but I give him a lot of credit for his honesty. Let me say this. From our standpoint, we have very hard options. This is not an easy way out. The problem is how we got here, which I do not want to repeat the history, the failed policies of the previous American administration, and frankly, even other administrations were weak on Iran. That Iran is now on the cusp and has been on the cusp, of course, of becoming a nuclear power. That is, from my perspective, what drives our policy. The problem is, and I think the president was right, he's saying we're not going to feel good for 5 or 6 years of buying security and then actually license Iran to almost have, under the agreement, the ability to develop nuclear weapons in a few years. So he bit the bullet, meaning the president. By that expression, I mean he decided very directly to say this is not going to happen. We're going to put pressure on Iran through sanctions to change its policy and to really call it what it is, which is a terrorist state. The problem with, or the challenge for us right now is, I think there will be stiffer sanctions coming, but the options become more difficult. There's a question of whether Iran will really come through with its threats and escalate and continue to do the types of activities it's been engaged in, and then, frankly, lead to a confrontation, or whether Iran will come to its senses after it does this types of antics and decide, because of sanctions, but by scoring some points, to have the West come and suggest discussions and agree to those. I would hope it'd be the latter. But the president is not going to change course on sanctions. That is for sure. And in fact, there might be some military response if our allies are aligned. Ultimately, our goal is to change the Iranian regime's behavior. And that is our goal. And our goal is to keep it from becoming a nuclear power in the region.
Adolfo Franco, thank you very much. I want to bring in Mohammed Marandi here. I want to come to Doha as well, and to you, Nader Hashmi, but we are running out of time. So very quickly, Mohammed Marandi, it's the sanctions that are the real issue here. If the sanctions are lifted, the Iranians will come back to the negotiating table. Is that the upshot of it?
No, it's not at all that. It's U.S. aggression in this region, just like in Syria. As we know in WikiLeaks, the United States knew Saudi Arabia was supporting ISIS, and they were destroying Syria, and they hide the reality like your two guests do. And I also disagree that Trump your guest in Doha said Trump opened the door for negotiations. That's nonsense. The United States is engaging in economic warfare against ordinary Iranians. The Iranians were sitting with the United States at the negotiating table, and that was the United States that left the table after tearing up the agreement. The Iranians signed the nuclear agreement in order to create stability in this region, and they gave significant concessions to get there. But Trump tore that agreement. The Iranians have said if the U.S. goes back to the deal, that they will accept a new state of affairs, meaning negotiations can take place. So it's up to the United States, not the Iranians. Iran's not going to appease the United States. And finally, Saudi Arabia is heading towards a cliff, and so is the United Arab Emirates. Whether your guests like it or not, they cannot continue this war with Yemen and get away with it. The Yemenis are getting stronger. The Saudis are getting weaker. The Saudis are unable to protect themselves despite spending hundreds of billions of dollars, wasting their money, giving them to the United States. And the United States has shown nothing for all its presence in the region. The United States is only creating instability. And believe you me that if the war in Yemen
Sorry, Mohammed, we are running out of time. I do want to come to Nader Hashmi as well, so I'm going to have to stop you there. Nader, this is, once again, all about the politics of this. It's sanctions. It's about the regional players, Saudi Arabia. It's about Iran. It's about the US role. Saudi Arabia seems to be reliant on the US. Often it's been said that Saudi Arabia will fight any war to the last American. Is that a bad policy? Is that a failed policy? Should things change for Saudi Arabia?
Well, Saudi Arabia, the House of Saud, they're not getting much sleep these days because they were hoping that Donald Trump would be their savior. So they're in a state of shock right now that on 2 occasions when Trump had the opportunity to strike at Iran that they haven't. So there's going to be a lot of soul searching in Saudi Arabia about its relationship with the United States. I don't think they have many good options. But these are difficult days for the dictators in Riyadh. But more broadly speaking, I think in terms of diplomacy, next week is a unique opportunity when all of the heads of state of the members of the UN will be in New York. The French proposal, which we haven't talked about, which looked like it had some legs, which looked like it could sort of be perhaps a way out of this conundrum, needs to be revived. And, Emmanuel Macron, the French president, will be there as well. Rouhani will be there. So will Trump. Let's hope that cooler heads prevail and there can be a way out of this disastrous conflict that's the responsibility of all of the dictators and authoritarian regimes in the Middle East, including the international players led by the United States, which has to bear a lot of responsibility for this.
And I'm afraid
particularly
we
Donald
are
Trump.
out of time. I want to thank all our guests, Nader Hashemi, Mohammed Morandi, and Adolfo Franco. And thank you too for watching. You can see the program anytime by visiting our website, aljazeera.com. And for further discussion, go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. And you can also join the conversation on Twitter. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story. From me, Imran Khan, and the whole team here, bye for now.